lack of clarity, but that his unpopularity, which is demonstrated in polls, is what dragged them down.
Well, look, let me pick that point up about the polls. I mean, you'll know, because it's Sky's sort of analysis. Rawlings and Thrasher, country's leading experts, have forecast that on the results this week you'd have a hung parliament. That means Keir Starmer's not on course to win a majority, and that's before an election campaign where Labour's lack of policy would come under scrutiny. So what that shows for me is very clear. The polls are not correct. There's everything to fight for, and the Conservative Party, under the Prime Minister's leadership, is absolutely up for that fight.
Well, look, I mean, you know, we always want to be helpful here at Sky, but this is grabbing at straws a bit, isn't it? You actually took a whacking.
No, I was very clear. Look, these were disappointing results, but the point is, what they demonstrate from that scenario is that Labour's not on course for that majority. Keir Starmer hasn't sealed the deal with the public. So that means there's a fight to be had. The Prime Minister's up for that fight. I'm up for that fight. And I know the Conservative Party is up for it. We have to focus on delivering on people's priorities. That's what the Prime Minister is doing. And then we have to get out there and sell that message and then set out what we do after an election with a Conservative victory.
OK, well, let's talk about the weapons that you're going to bring to that fight. Andy Street was pretty clear to Tory colleagues last night on Sky News about what he thinks you need to do now. Stop talking to about leadership, move to the centre, focus on delivery. Here's what he said to my colleague Sophie Ridge.
Are you worried about the Conservative Party drifting to the right, to overemphasising the threat from reform and ignoring other voters?
I would definitely not advise that drift. I mean, the psephology here is really very straightforward, isn't it? This is the youngest, most diverse, one of the most urban places in Britain, and we've done, many would say, extremely well over a consistent period. And the local council results across many of our councils here in the West Midlands yesterday were also extremely encouraging. So the message is clear. Winning from that centre ground is what happens.
Would you endorse that message?
Look, Andy was absolutely right about the campaign that he's run. Look, what he's talking about there is what I just said. He's talking about you focus on the priorities of the British people. That's what you do. That's
but he said a little bit more than that. He said, don't be seduced by those who, for example, will be saying this morning, that you didn't fight this like real Conservatives. You need to be more conservative, more tax cuts, move to the right, emphasise issues like immigration and so on and so forth. He's saying, don't do that.
No, we're going to stick to focusing on the priorities that the Prime Minister set out, which are the government's priorities, the Prime Minister's priorities, but they're also the priorities of the British people about dealing with the economy, continuing to get inflation down. You know, we've done a lot of work there, got it down to just under 4%, but there's still more work to do. We've got to get down to the Bank of England's target so we can see interest rates falling, which are important for working families who have mortgages to pay. We've made a clear commitment on stopping the boats. We've now got the Rwanda legislation through, opposed, I should say, every step by the Labour Party, who've, of course, set out that if they were to win, they wouldn't try and remove any of those people from the country that are here. They'd effectively have an amnesty for illegal migrants. That's not the British people's priority, so we're going to keep focusing on those, setting those out as we move towards that general election.
I'm wondering whether you really got to grips with the scale of this. On Thursday, you won fewer council seats than Labour, and more importantly, you won fewer council seats than the Liberal Democrats. I know that these are local elections, so you can't translate completely, but is it morally right that what is now the third most popular party is squatting in Downing Street?
No, I don't accept that analysis at all. Look, local elections...
The Liberal Democrats beat you.
No, they didn't. It depended on the... If you look at the national equivalent vote share, the votes across the country, that's not correct. It just happens to be whatever councils were up for election. Look, local elections are always difficult for a governing party. I've been in politics for a long time. That's almost always true. The comparison for this set of elections, by the way, was, of course, very unusual. 2021, we had the vaccine bounce. I think independent and experts acknowledged that was a very high watermark. That was our best set of local elections since 2008. So compared to that, it was always going to be very, very difficult, and that's what we saw. But we are very focused on the fight to come. As I said, we're going to keep focusing on the public's priorities, And what these results show is that the result of the next election is not predetermined. There's everything to fight for, and I know the Conservative Party, under the Prime Minister's leadership, is absolutely up for that fight.
Yeah, but some very well-informed people think that your biggest problem is the public is no longer listening to you. Let me put the words of a fellow television presenter who's been at this a long time to you. He said, "I think the public's already made their mind up. I think Rishi Sunak could fly over the UK tonight in a helicopter and drop £1 million down every chimney and they'd still vote him out." Now, as well as being a television presenter, Lee Anderson was the deputy chairman of your party. I sort of imagine he knows what he's talking about. Hasn't he got the mood of the nation right?
Well, look, he's now in an opposition political party. And by the way, he's in a party now, Reform, where, frankly, it's very clear from the results that any Conservative who chooses to vote for Reform just gets more Labour people elected. So a vote for Reform is a vote for a Labour government, effectively, something to do the opposite of what most of those people want to see. But no, I don't think he's right at all. And I don't think people have stopped listening, actually. The evidence, if you take Ben Houchen's win, is that somebody who delivers...
one success in the last 3 days.
Yeah, but it's important. It's about someone who delivered, who, in an area of the country, by the way, Labour were really hoping to win that. They threw everything at it. Keir Starmer and the Shadow Cabinet were there a lot, and they didn't. And we had a very close race. In the West Midlands, which, given where the national opinion polls, is a credit to Andy Street, actually. So I think people are listening. The challenge for the rest of the year is to continue getting that message out there.
You've pinned pretty much everything on Rwanda, on the Rwanda scheme. That's your flagship thing. You got legislation through, tick. Prime Minister told us last week that the flights would be taking off before summer, tick-ish. But his promise is not start the flights, it's stop the boats. And this week, we saw the highest figure for channel crossings in small boats ever. It's all going in the wrong direction for you.
No, I don't accept that. Look,
well, that's just a fact.
The legislation took longer to get on the statute book than we would have liked. It was opposed by Labour and Liberal Democrat peers in the House of Lords.
They're not into government. You're in government.
Well, no, but you do have to get legislation through Parliament, and we don't have a majority in the House of Lords. But we've got the legislation on the statute book, and the whole point of this legislation is to have a deterrent, to break the business model of those organised criminal gangs who traffic people across the Channel. And once we get flights going and we have a steady rhythm of flights, that will send a very clear deterrent message. And we've already seen from what the Irish government have said that that deterrent effect is starting to work. We saw over the last year, so not one day's figures, we saw the number of people coming to Britain on those boats fall by a third. That was at a time when the number of people coming into the EU illegally was going up. So we've had some success, but I absolutely accept we've got more to do, and it'll be that sort of...
It is a bit of a cheek to claim people going to Ireland as the success of your policy.
Well, no, I'm just setting up what the Irish government said. They've said that people are going to the Irish Republic, other parts of the EU, because they can see that they don't want to be deported to Rwanda. That is exactly what we're hoping to achieve.
And to be clear, you're not going to do a deal with the Irish, are you, for returns?
Well, we've made it quite clear we're not going to accept returns back from the EU via Ireland when the EU won't let us send people back to the EU to France. So, you know, they've made it quite clear they won't do that, and our view remains very clear.
All right, last question. Is it really not time to put everybody out of their misery and have a general election? I mean, you're stringing it out. Great work for people like me, but the country is out there saying, isn't it time that we settle this?
Well, no, look, the Prime Minister said right from the beginning of this year that his working assumption was the election would be in the second half of this year. That remains the case, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah, he wouldn't, by the way, say with me last week whether July was in the second part of the year, look, which I think is a bit... That's quite a tricky thing, isn't it?
He was very clear, but look, it's for this reason, as I said. He is focused on the British people's priorities and about delivering lower inflation, stopping the boats, focusing on getting NHS waiting lists down. We've made a lot of progress, but I absolutely accept there's more to do on that, and he wants to continue delivering on those priorities before we go to the country.
Mark Harper, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the former number 10 Communications Director to Boris Johnson, Good Harry, Financial Times columnist and former advisor to the Liberal Democrats, Miranda Green, and the former editor of the Financial Times, now broadcaster and author, Lionel Barber. And on this election-heavy weekend, Sky's own election analyst, Professor Michael Thrasher. Michael, let me start with you. What do these results tell us about the likely outcome of a general election?
Well, they confirm, don't they, that the Conservatives are in a very bad place with an election likely to be held later this year. They suffered heavy seat losses, lost councils, just all-round disastrous performance. They then lost the mayors and so on. So they have very little to hang on to. But interestingly, probably the only thing that they can hang on to is that Labour's performance wasn't stellar by no means. I mean, in terms of the national equivalent vote, they went backwards compared with last year. So, if you like, it does demonstrate to me that whilst the Conservatives are clearly on track to lose the general election, it's not wholly clear to me that Labour can win an overall majority. And it's a real task that they face there.
It's a very interesting point. I mean, one of the things that's become clear from your analysis is that though the opinion polls are regularly telling us that Labour is 20 points ahead, from your analysis of the real votes, the gap is much smaller than that.
Yes, I mean, we can pick our, if you like, metric in terms of assessing where the parties lie. And if you do choose the opinion polls, they point to one clear outcome. The swing, according to those polls, is so large that Labour will win the general election. If you took the Blackpool South by-election contest, the Conservatives would be around about 100 seats left in the House of Commons. But we had local council elections, and for the past 38 years, we've been projecting those vote shares in local council elections into a national picture. So it's not a forecast that we make, it's a projection.
Well, we can see this, can't we? There's what you call the national equivalent vote.
Yeah, and so for many, many years, for the Sunday Times and also for Sky, I've been conducting this exercise of looking at what's happening in the local election votes and seeing how far the gap is between the various different parties. And we can see there the picture in terms of the national equivalent vote that we assessed from yesterday is Labour on 34th. They were on 36 last year. The Conservatives on 27th. They were on 29 last year. And that large group of other parties, if you like, on 23%. So that's the picture that we have now. And I think it pays to look at the historic picture. And lots of people, for very clear and understandable reasons, want to compare where we are now with the Blair position prior to the 1997 general election. And if we can see that, we see a very large gap indeed between the blue line and the red line.
You can see that in 1995. Yeah.
Yeah. So
at the left end of the graph. Yeah.
So the gap there is over 20 points, right? And so it was fairly clear in 95, 96 that the Conservatives were just kind of disappearing through the floor, and that Blair was going to win a general election. But the opinion polls were telling a much better story for Labour. And I remember talking to Tony Blair after the 95 elections, and he was quite concerned that they hadn't done as well. And I said, well...
A 97 election?
No, after the 95 local elections.
Okay.
And he was quite concerned about that they hadn't done as well as, some people had said they were going to do. And I said, you got 47 on the national equivalent vote. And that's still Labour's record. And again, in terms of the historic series on that graph, Gordon Brown was in a very bad place in 2008 and 2009. If you remember, we were all saying, call a general election. And he was in a really bad place. But he clawed it back before the 2010 election, such that he deprived the Conservatives of an overall majority. But again, he was clawing back a lead of around about 20 points. The point that I really want to make now, in terms of assessing the overall situation, is that the gap between Conservative and Labour on the projection that we've done from the May 2nd elections, the gap is only 7 points. It needs to be at least double that for Labour to win.
So we're still in suspense. Anything could happen. Miranda, what did you make of Mark Harper's reaction to this? It seems to be steady as it goes, we're going to stick with it.
The plan is working, allegedly, but it's clearly not, is it? It's a bit like that old adage, you know, you don't like this ham and eggs, well, here's some more ham and eggs. You need to change what you're offering the electorate, clearly, because, you know, for all Michael's kind of caveats, what has been clear over the last 3 days is that the Tory tide is going out, no matter what you think about the degree to which the Labour tide is coming in. And they're in trouble everywhere. You know, it was a miracle for Andy Street to do as well as he did, really, in the West Midlands, even though he was finally pipped at the post, against this kind of dramatic disappearance of Tory support right across the country. So I think, you know, it's a sticky wicket, as they say, for any cabinet minister going out to defend a government when the electorate's turned against them in this way, I think. But my fear is that they will take the wrong message from this set of results, veer to the right to try and recapture this kind of reform-minded set of voters. And electorally, it would be a disaster from them because you can see what happened in the south where the Lib Dems, the Greens were making inroads, and that way lies an even bigger electoral disaster for Rishi Sunak, I think.
I want to come back to talk about that grey line, which is independent at 23%, because I think that's an interesting feature here. But let's just stick with the Tories for the moment, Gutto. Do you agree with Miranda?
Yeah, I think the really important message here is not, you know, none of those people were wiped out because the party's not right-wing and extreme enough. So 3 things have happened. One is, you know, Andy Street, class act, decent mayor, lost, not because he wasn't right-wing enough. So that's a warning. The Lib Dems have done well. That's another warning, that the challenge is on this flank, not on this flank. And we've just had a defection from the party. Didn't go to Reform on this occasion, it went to Labour. So 3 reasons for finally waking up and smelling the coffee that the answer is to govern competently, to unite behind the team leader, to focus on between now and November, trying to be a competent party of government, using the mandate for a purpose, and stop this psychodrama and neuroses about what the opinion polls are doing.
Lionel, there will be people in the Conservative Party who are saying, contrary to what Miranda and Gutto have just been saying, that the problem here is that they're being Labour light. That actually, that what the electorate really wants is a proper choice.
Well, I saw some of that in the Telegraph this morning with Suella Braverman essentially saying we need to bang more people up in prison, we need to be really tough on illegal immigration and lots of tax cuts. And I think that we saw a little bit up with Liz Truss, didn't go down very well. I mean, Rishi Sunak's bet is that there can be enough change in terms of interest rate cuts, the national insurance cuts coming in, that things will be better. So it's jam tomorrow, not today.
Get a flight off and that the boats will stop coming in?
I honestly, I think if you look at what's happening in America, for example, last week, Jerome Powell at the Fed saying, not yet, we're not ready to cut interest rates, everybody's waiting. So we could be disappointed in that respect. And I'm not sure it translates into that feel-good factor that Rishi Sunak is aiming for.
It's their only hope, though, isn't it? Their only hope is that the economic indicators get a bit better and that people start to feel a sense of confidence and even, you know, John Major's phrase, green shoots, because that's the only thing that will get them out of this deep, deep, you know, electoral pit that they're in at the moment. But it's a real long shot because memories of Liz Truss's unsuccessful period live on in people's mortgages, you know, so it's really tough.
I think Mark Harper was indicating that they need to go long. I think we can probably see that the outcome...
How long if you've only got a few months?
Well, long in terms of months rather than weeks. Let's come back to our graph, Mike. I just want to ask you about one thing here. If we look at that graph, one of the interesting features is that grey line at the bottom, which back in 1995 was, you know, 5%. That's the independents, the fringe parties and so on. Now up at 23%. 2 things. First of all, do you think that's could persist in a general election? And secondly, who suffers most?
Oh, that's a very difficult question to answer. But I'm glad you asked it. But I'm glad you've asked it. Basically, that line comprises, and incidentally, doing the House of Commons projection, I've been criticised for having, with others so high, but they weren't complaining when I was doing it with UKIP on 22 and UKIP on 18. They never seemed to complain at that point. It comprises the Greens. It comprises reform. And it comprises this mass of independents, partly a splintering of local Labour parties in some areas, and just independents. Whether this carries over into a general election, I really don't know. I don't think we can completely dismiss people going into the election, because what we know is that people are less aligned with political parties now. And many people may go into that general election saying, I can't bring myself to vote for the Conservatives anymore, but I'm not really that impressed by Labour either. I know a vote for the Greens, a vote for reform and so on isn't going to make them win the seat, but from the viewpoint of Labour and the Conservatives, which of those small fractional parties does well is critical, absolutely critical to the outcome, because if reform get around about 10 to 15% of the share of the vote, then the Conservatives will lose many more seats, regardless of the national swing. And if the Labour Party vote continues to remain splintered, a lot of the targets that Labour have on their battle plan simply won't fall to them, because these people aren't going to support them.
Good. So probably the biggest single chunk there in that grey line is probably reform, and that's quite a big issue for the Conservatives. They've got to make a bet, presumably, that some of that vote is going to come, which is we've shown before, 90% or thereabouts are former Tory voters. The Tories have got to make a bet that some of those people are going to come back home to the Tories. Is that a good bet?
Absolutely. I mean, a vote for reform is a vote for Labour. And so it should become clearer and clearer the closer we get to a general election that if you want Keir Starmer to be number 10, then flirt with the fringes of British politics, go there out on the right sort of limb and play with throwing away your vote to achieve the exact opposite of what you claim to believe in. That should be a very clear message. And it comes back to where the real battle is, as it always has been, and where the victories always are the people who manage to sit on that sweet spot at the centre of British politics. Labour Prime Ministers are successful when they almost pretend to be Conservative. And Conservative Prime Ministers are at their most successful when they tick off those boxes and soothe the conscience of people by seeming to be a bit more sort of soft and Labour. And I know people in the party hate hearing that, but it's true.
God, I didn't realise Margaret Thatcher was Labour light.
Well, Margaret Thatcher maybe, but look at David Cameron with the Huskies and the Green and all the obsession, rightly, with the NHS.
The green crap, I think.
No.
About,
well, when
then dropped.
He didn't use the word green crap. Somebody else did, and they still
who
do.
was that, Guto?
They throw overboard.
Name names.
Well, it wasn't me. It's sort of because I think the Conservatives are at their most successful when they own the sort of green agenda, not disown it. They're at their most successful when they are signed-up members of the human race, not this nasty little bunch on the right.
But we are ignoring Blackpool too much, I think, because this crucial question of whether Labour can take back that Northern and Midlands territory that Boris Johnson was so good at picking up and Theresa May before him will be crucial to the outcome. And I do think people behave differently at a general election. It's really important to remember that.
OK. We are coming up to 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Transport Secretary has played down calls for a general election after a bad set of results for the Conservatives in local elections. Mark Harper said the party needs to get behind Rishi Sunak, and the Prime Minister's focused on delivering priorities before going to the country. Lots more to come this morning after that shock Sky News projection suggesting that Labour could still miss out on a Commons majority. We'll hear shortly from the party's campaign coordinator, Pat McFadden. Plus, the man who could be the next First Minister of Scotland, SNP leadership candidate John Swinney. Andrea Jenkins was the first Tory MP to call for Rishi Sunak to go, nearly 6 months ago. We'll hear if she's changed her mind. And away from domestic politics, the bruising political row marring the world's biggest music show, Eurovision's organisers explain why Israel has been allowed to compete, telling me the contest is no place for politics. Let's turn to Labour now. A little earlier, I spoke to Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Labour's National Cabinet Campaign Coordinator, Pat McFadden, for his take on his party's performance in the local elections. Pat McFadden, am I right in saying that the general election is now Labour's to lose?
Well, we had excellent results, and in particular that cliffhanger in the West Midlands that was announced last night. That was beyond our expectations and was a really fantastic result. We've come a long way in the last few years under Keir Starmer's leadership. People are looking at a changed Labour Party, and there's a mood for change in the country.
Well, it looks as though Pat McFadden, for once, has gone silent. We'll try and get back to that interview in a moment. But if I can come back to you, Michael, on what you were saying. It's counterintuitive, isn't it, after the drubbing that the Tories have had, to think that Labour might not get a majority?
Yes, and it really reflects where we were in 2019, because the Conservatives won a majority of 80 seats, which is now, because of the boundary changes, gone up to 94. That's a big majority to overturn now.
It's a bigger task than Blair had in 1997, isn't it?
It certainly is, and therefore, just to get a majority of 2 seats in the next House of Commons, Labour has to come from just over 200 seats to 326. You don't, 125 or so gains to win a majority of 2. Now, the swing required to do that, the national uniform swing from Conservative to Labour, is 12.7. And people are probably at home going, 12.7, what does that mean? It's just a number, right? I put it into perspective. Tony Blair, who has the post-war record swing, got 10.3. So Starmer and Labour have to break Tony Blair's record of 1997 considerably by 12.7% swing, which means, translated into terms that people are familiar with in terms of where we are in the opinion polls, Labour requires a 14 or 15 point lead over the Conservatives to get into Downing Street. That's huge. And people will say, well, they're there now. But as we all know, as we get closer and closer to the general election, people's minds start to get fixed in terms of where they're going to be. I'm not saying that the lead won't be still 15 points or so, by the way. I'm just saying it's a very big lead that Labour needs over the Conservatives. That lead that we found on analysing the local elections was just 7 points. As I said before, they need to double that.
Lionel, you'll see this when and if we eventually get Pat McFadden's interview back. But I was intrigued by something he said to me right at the very end of the interview. I can't quote his words exactly because I haven't got them in front of me. But he essentially, I asked him, are we now going to see a more adventurous Labour Party? Are we now going to hear some actual policies? And he gave me, in a sense, the obvious answer, oh yes, we've got lots of policies. But then he said, watch this space, you're going to hear a lot more from us. Does Labour still need to do a little bit more to define itself?
No question. I think he's been excessively cautious to a degree, and I think partly is because he's looking at the kind of wall and the scale of the challenge in the next election coming up. But the problem is, if you put me through my Viva, my test this morning, and you ask me what are the 3 big things that Labour stands for, I think I'd get a B-. I mean, I'm not very clear. It feels... No, I'm being very honest, Trevor. I mean, you know, I said the same thing in 2016 in the presidential election when what did Hillary stand for, apart from it's my turn? So I think what we're missing here is that energy, that real is it's not enough to say these Tories have been here for 14 years, enough.
All right, well, look, let's see. Rather than me ventriloquising Pat McFadden, I think we can hear from the man himself. We can take his interview now. Pat McFadden, am I right in saying that the general election is now Labour's to lose?
Well, we had excellent results, and in particular that cliffhanger in the West Midlands that was announced last night. That was beyond our expectations and was a really fantastic result. We've come a long way in the last few years under Keir Starmer's leadership. People are looking at a changed Labour Party, and there's a mood for change in the country. And I think these results have given us confidence and belief. But of course, a general election is a different thing. Not a vote's been cast in it, and I'll be the first to say to the party, enjoy this moment, but we've still got a lot of work to do.
Is this characteristic McFadden gloom, that there's a parade, so you're going to rain on it?
I don't want to rain on anybody's parade. I think we should enjoy this moment, and we've worked very hard, and I'm grateful to the voters who've turned to us, perhaps for the first time or for the first time in a long time. But we know that winning the trust of the British people at a general election is a big task. It's one that we are determined to throw everything at. So after enjoying this moment, we're not going to take our foot off the gas. We're not going to down tools. We are going to keep going between now and the election to build on those fantastic results over the last couple of days.
Let's talk about the size of that task, because it is big. You won in West Midlands, but by the slimmest of margins. Your leader went to Harlow, I think twice, and said, this is a council we need to win. You didn't win it. You're actually 1% down in your share from last year. And on the basis of the votes cast yesterday, our analysts are saying that your real lead's about 7 points. You've still got a long way to go before you can be sure that you're heading for a majority.
Of course, we've still got work to do, but let me respond to one or two of the things that you listed there. I mean, we just fell short in Harlow, but when I look across the south of England, we now have twice as many councils there as the Tories. They've lost 3/4 of their councils in the southeast in the past couple of years. We won in Rushmore in Hampshire for the first time in decades. We gained in Thurrock. We have been gaining seats in Crawley, in Swindon, in Plymouth, across the south. There is, I think, a slightly lazy assumption about this stuff about walls, red walls and blue walls, that somehow in the south the battle is between the Tories and the Lib Dems. It is not. It's very much between the Tories and Labour too. You might remember the pamphlet, Southern Discomfort.
I do.
The Tories are experiencing some southern discomfort right now.
Now we're both revealing our age. Let's just deal with the scene now. Are you worried about the impact of smaller parties and independents? The Greens took quite a lot of seats away possibly from you, and there was the Galloway factor that took something like 70,000 votes in the West Midlands, for example.
Look, wherever we are, maybe losing support that we maybe had before, of course we take that into account and we want to win support back. But over the piece, this was an excellent set of results for us. And it's not just about overall share of the vote that you mentioned. It's about the map. It's about the seats, the decisive parliamentary seats that will make the difference at the next election. I've seen Labour in the past celebrating share of the vote by piling up votes in places where we were already strong. The efficiency of our vote and the efficiency of our targeting operation made a big difference to the results over the past couple of days. And that really matters when it comes to an election.
And it's clearly, you've clearly adopted this strategy of focusing and so on, but there's an overall feeling, I think probably the way to put this is some perspective. In order to get a majority, you need to do better than Tony Blair did in 1997, and you're nowhere near that. You and I were both around in that election. You were closer to it than I was. Does this feel like 1997 to you? It doesn't look like it to me.
It's a different time. We've got different people, different politics. So I'm asked all the time, perhaps because I was around, does this feel like 1997? But I don't want to, for you to say, de-emphasise the importance of what happened over the past couple of days, because Labour's been on a losing streak for a long time. These results should give Labour belief and confidence. Yes, we've got more work to do, but these Tories are beatable. They will fight hard, but I think there's a mood for change in the country now, and we will meet that mood for change.
Well, let's look at one of the other issues that you face. You lost seats in the north and votes elsewhere because of some voters' disaffection, particularly Muslim voters' disaffection, with your leader's initial response on Gaza. And that's a point that Keir Starmer seemed to acknowledge in when he spoke after the West Midlands result last night. What are you actually planning to say to those voters now to bring them back?
I think this has been an issue in some areas, and I said this when I did some interviews the other day. And we understand why people have got strong feelings about this. After all, thousands of innocent people have been killed, and there's a humanitarian impulse to help people, which we share. And where voters are feeling strongly about that, we want to win their support back. And on this issue itself, it's really important to get more aid and more help to the people in Gaza, because the humanitarian circumstances there it's an absolutely terrible situation. And when it comes to the general election itself, if we are trusted to govern, a better future for the Palestinians and a big priority for that area will be a big priority for...
If I may say so, you've been saying all of this for a while. The misstep was originally the interview that your leader did, in which he appeared to line up pretty decisively on one side. What can you possibly do now to persuade those who think that Labour has essentially abandoned, except for the words, abandoned people in Gaza to take sides with Israel?
Well, we said two things all the way through this, that Israel had a right to defend itself after the terrible events of October the 7th, but also that we wanted a better future for the Palestinian people. And those two things will continue to guide us on this issue as we go forward.
All right. One of the areas of the electorate that you have to focus on is getting back in Scotland. Scotland was always part of the backbone of Labour victories in the past. The SNP looks like it's going to get a new leader who has promised to reunite its party. We don't know if there's going to be a contest or not. But would you have been happier if the SNP had stuck with Humza Yousaf as a weakened, unpopular leader?
I don't think it matters who the SNP leader is now, because I think there's been...
Seriously?
A big change. Yes, seriously. I think, let them have this, if there's a contest or not. I don't think it makes much difference, because in Scotland, just as in England, there is a mood for change. In Scotland, just as in England, there is a tired government in office that has run out of steam and run out of ideas. And one of the big changes that has happened, apart from the scandals surrounding the SNP in the last year, is that this issue of lack of delivery on the basic job of the government around health, education, and other services, which the SNP had shielded by keeping the constitutional issue on the boil year after year. That has now changed, and people are looking at delivery, and there is a mood for change, which a party that's been in power for as long as the SNP have cannot meet. And the Scottish Labour Party, under the leadership of Anas Sarwar, is much better placed than we have been for many, many years.
But this matters, doesn't it? Because it's been predicted by some, and our analysts are saying that this is a possibility, a strong possibility, that on the basis of the results that we've got in the last couple of days, Labour might not get a majority, but might be the biggest party. Can you imagine a Labour administration working alongside and supported by an SNP group in Westminster?
No. You're quite right to say you've still got a job to do. That's the first thing I say to everybody after these results. We've still got a job to do. Our aim is to win a majority, to govern, to meet the mood for change, and we're not planning any alliances or pacts with anyone.
But isn't this is part of the new Labour realism, isn't it? You have to provide for the possibility that you won't win. So let me put it to you again. Would you rule out the idea of a cooperation with the SNP if the numbers led there?
Trevor, you could put it to me from now until Christmas, and my answer will be the same. We are going to aim for a majority government. We're going to meet that mood for change. We're not planning on any pacts or alliances with anyone. I think after the results of the last few days, we go into that fight with no complacency, but with a belief and confidence that we've seen in the votes that were cast a few days ago.
OK, lastly, can I just ask, in a way, a personal question, personal to me, not to you. Your colleagues have told me in the last couple of weeks you're ready for a general election any time. Does that mean that over the next few months, when you and your colleagues come in here, you're going to be unveiling some actual policies that will tell us what a Labour government might look like, rather than telling us that the Tories are bad?
I think we've unveiled plenty of policies in the last few weeks. If you look at what we've said during the local election campaign, for example, we talked about how we'd revive our high streets. We talked about bringing buses back under local control. These are ambitions.
These are not policies.
We talked about building houses. They are policies. There is a myth, and in fact, I'm afraid a Tory line out there that somehow they're the only people with a plan and not us. But I'll give you this. I do think as we get closer to the election, people do want to hear more about policies and plans for change. And we will be saying more about that because, to borrow a phrase from, I think, the team that you may support, the manager of it, we're not going to stop. We're not going to down tools. We're going to keep on going after the results we've had for the last few days. So you will hear more about our plans in the coming weeks.
I am looking forward to that. Pat McFadden, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, SNP leadership candidate and by extension hopeful to be the next First Minister of Scotland, John Swinney. What impact will he have on his party and the shape of Scottish politics?
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky's West of England correspondent.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. We help you to understand the world with us.
I'm Adam Parsons, I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm one of Sky's Midlands correspondents. The reason I do this job is because you never know where it's going to lead.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before?
yes.
Cheers. We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world, the likes of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sir Elton John. We try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Welcome back. Let's turn to Scotland, where there's been a week of high drama despite no local elections actually taking place. Though that could be about to change. John Swinney is currently the front runner to replace Humza Yousaf as leader of the SNP and the next First Minister of Scotland. But there are reports this morning of a possible leadership rival. So Mr. Swinney could face a leadership contest rather than a coronation. He joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Swinney.
Good morning, Trevor.
First of all, what can you tell us about the possibility of this leadership challenge? I assume that they won't come to you directly, but is that still a possibility as far as you know?
The process that we go through is a democratic process. Nominations for the party leadership vacancy close tomorrow at noon. My nomination is in, it's been accepted by the party secretary, but obviously there is the facility for any party member to stand if they can get the requisite 100 signatures from 20 local organisations around the country. And so we'll know the answer to that question tomorrow. If there is one candidate that's nominated tomorrow, then I will be elected as party leader. If there's more than one, then we'll have a contest which will stretch over a 3-week period.
I know it would obviously be wrong for you to discourage any other party member to participate in democracy, but a leadership contest would not be a good thing for the SNP, would it?
I think where we are just now is that my bid to become SNP leader has received very, very comprehensive support within the SNP. I set out a message which is about unifying the SNP, to strengthen our party and to win Scottish independence. I think that's necessary because the SNP is not as cohesive today as the party needs to be. And my campaign has attracted very wide support, but especially it's attracted the support and endorsement of Kate Forbes, who contested the leadership 12 months ago. And I really welcome that. So I think the SNP's got a chance to start rebuilding from the difficult period that we have had under my leadership. And bluntly, I'd just like to sort of get on with that as quickly as I possibly can do, because every day that we spend in an internal contest, which I think we all probably know the outcome of, we delay the ability for the SNP to start its rebuilding, and I want to get on with that as quickly as I possibly can do.
Thank you for that very frank answer, which I am going to summarise as a message to any potential contenders, which is don't. Let's talk about what your predecessor, Hamza Yusuf, said, that if the SNP won a majority of seats at the next general elections, that would be a mandate for another independence referendum. Is that your view too?
My view is that we've got to recognise that we've got to build further support for Scottish independence. Independence is supported now by more people than supported it in 2014 in the last referendum. But it's not supported by enough people for it to be a compelling proposition within Scotland. So what I think our priority has got to be is to spend less time discussing the mechanics and the thresholds about independence, but to start winning the arguments about why independence is an absolute necessity for people in Scotland. And let me give you a couple of examples about why that is the case. The cost of living crisis, which is affecting people, every household in Scotland, is a product of Westminster decision-making, the folly of the Liz Truss budget, which has increased housing costs for families the length and breadth of Scotland. That is a decision of Westminster, which is an argument for Scotland taking better decisions in our own hands. The Tory-imposed Brexit, which we never voted for in Scotland, is causing huge damage to businesses and individuals in Scotland. That's a decision we could have avoided had we been an independent country. So these are some of the arguments I want to make to patiently persuade people of the merits of independence. These are the arguments that will convince people, and I think that's where we've got to concentrate our efforts.
I understand that, but what I am taking from what you're saying, is it, or would it be unfair to take from what you're saying that still set on independence, but you think that competence in the Scottish government has to come before the next independence referendum? Convincing Scottish people that the SNP can be trusted in government will come before any next referendum.
I think there's two things, Trevor. You're right in most of that. I think there's got to be confidence in the SNP government in its delivery on the priorities that matter to people in Scotland. And for me, those are centred around the delivery of economic growth and social justice, the eradication of curses like child poverty within our society. But then also there has to be confidence in the arguments for independence. And that's where I think we've got work to do, and we've got work to do on both fronts, to be honest, and that's why I've re-entered the fray. I stood down a year ago as Deputy First Minister because I felt I had had a long time in government and it was time for other faces to come in. My party faces difficulties now, and I think it's time for me to come back in, bring the party together and make the positive arguments for an SNP government and for independence. In bringing the party together, you have united with Kate Ford. What job are you going to offer her? Obviously, we're getting a wee bit ahead of ourselves, Trevor. These things will come should I be elected as First Minister. You and she must have spoken there. As your first question said to me, there's a couple of hurdles we've got to get over before we get to that. Kate and I have spoken, of course we have. I really welcome her support. I think she's got an important contribution to make to the national life of Scotland. And I've made it clear that she will have a significant role within any government that I have the privilege to lead. All right, let's say that you do become the head of Scotland's government. One of the things you're going to have to deal with in the next 9 months is the general election across the United Kingdom. If you have a choice, Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer? Well, I certainly think a Labour government would be preferable to the awful, disastrous, terrible Conservative government that we have in place. So these are, in that choice, then I recognise a Labour government will be better than a Conservative government. But that's not the question that people in Scotland face. Can I just put it to you that I spoke to Pat McFadden, who you know very well, and I asked him, would he be up for an arrangement with the SNP? And he replied in a way that I think you will recognise from Pat McFadden with one word: no. Well, I know Pat well. Pat and I are old university buddies from the University of Edinburgh a lifetime ago. So I don't think Pat's public line to you is something that he would sustain in a decent conversation with me or with others. But look, what we have to recognise is that the public have got to be given their choice. I think they'll have that choice in the general election. The general election is due to take place between now and about the end of the year. And what the argument I'll make to people in Scotland is that we've got to make sure Scotland's interests are well protected by the election of a strong group of SNP members of Parliament. That's Scotland's protection against either a Conservative government that's been hostile to Scotland unreservedly or a Labour government that's got the habit of disappointing people. And I want to make sure people in Scotland realise that the best way to protect Scotland and to deliver for Scotland's interests is by voting SNP in the general election.
Last question, Mr Swinney. The biggest, strongest signal that you could send to the Scottish people about how you are going to govern would be how you deal with the Gender Recognition Act that Holyrood passed but was essentially blocked by Westminster Government, and that action was declared lawful by the Scottish court. So what are you going to do? Are you going to put that act on ice, forget about it? Are you going to try to amend it? What is your plan? Are you going to pursue that, what people call a cultural war issue, or are you now going to put it to one side?
I think I don't accept the premise of your question, Trevor, and let me explain why. You said to me that the biggest issue I could signal to the people of Scotland is how I handle this particular issue. I think the biggest thing I can signal to the people of Scotland is that I want to become the First Minister of Scotland so that we can concentrate on delivering economic growth and social justice for the people of Scotland, and that we can make Scotland a more successful country that can become an independent country. That is my driving, compelling proposition. And
putting that act into implementation would be a signal. Will you or won't you?
Well, what I'm saying is that I've set out what my priorities would be. Those are the driving priorities for me if I become the First Minister of Scotland. There are issues I've got to consider about gender reform. You're correct that the legislation cannot be put into force because of the legal judgments that have been made. I believe in the rule of law, so I accept the decisions of courts in that respect. And we have to consider what are the best steps to take forward. But what I've assured everybody about is that I believe in a good, solid process of respectful dialogue about these issues. We need more respectful dialogue about these processes, and we've got to make sure that we handle those issues with care and sensitivity, and that's what I'll bring to those discussions.
Mr Swinney, thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure.
Well, after the worst set of election results in 4 decades, can Rishi Sunak's premiership survive? Conservative MP Andrea Jenkins thinks he needs to be more radical. She joins me after the break. The story of these elections is, any way you slice it, a woeful set of results for the Conservatives. As the dust settles, questions are again mounting over whether Rishi Sunak's premiership can survive until a general election. Some of his MPs have, in recent months, called for him to go. Among them is Dame Andrea Jenkyns, who declared enough is enough in a letter of no confidence, and that was 174 days ago. Dame Andrea joins me now. Good morning, Dame Andrea.
Good morning, Trevor.
I said amongst them, but you are actually foremost. Is it time for Rishi Sunak to step down?
Look, I mean, I didn't realise it's 170 days. Hasn't the time flown?
Well, time flies when you're enjoying yourself, right?
No, I'm not enjoying myself at all. I'm just a happy person, Trevor. Look, MPs are not putting the letters in. Is not going anywhere. I've tried, as you know. So I think now we've got to take the fight to Labour. I'd like to see real common sense conservatism, honouring our manifesto commitments. I'd like to see the return of Boris on the front line of politics, whether that's going for a seat in the next election and being front and centre of our election campaign. And I'd also like to see Conservatives, in whatever party, unite and take this fight to Labour, because I do not want to see Starmer and his fake patriotism get into number 10.
Let's just unpack that a little bit. Bring back Boris as the face. Can you see Boris and Rishi Sunak, on joint visits and fronting a campaign together? Are you seriously thinking that's a possibility?
I haven't spoke to Boris. I haven't spoke to the Prime Minister about this, but I'm an optimist. I mean, I'm not sure whether they share the stage together, but I mean, look how wonderful it was. Boris campaigning in these elections. I thought it was wonderful to see that.
Gosh,
it's still got a pull, and it's still got a pull in my area. It's still on the doorstep, Trevor. People say to me, we're saddened that Boris is no longer on the front line of politics.
Yeah, you could get a whole bunch of former Prime Ministers together, add in Liz Truss. How would that work?
Well, let's have a big cabinet, show united Conservatives, shall we, Trevor? That's a good idea. Maybe take you up on that.
You must have heard what Andy Street said last night, that the Conservatives should resist the temptation to drift to the right.
He would say that. He's a lefty, isn't he? He would say that.
I'm sorry, Andy Street is a what?
Well, the left of our party is One Nation, isn't he? I mean, I thought he did a sterling job as mayor. I'd take my hat off to him. Him and I's had run-ins before over policy, but it's very sad to see him go. I'm sure it's not the last that we see of him. I'm sure he'll be on the front line of politics again. But look at Ben Houchen. He made the most of the opportunities of Brexit, is a plain-speaking northerner, and he won. So it's rubbish saying we've got to go to the centre of politics. I mean, he lost his seat. It's rubbish.
Dame Andrea, if I may say so, when you say it's sad to see him go, you don't sound all that sad. Just explain to me what the alternative is. What are the policies? What's the story that you want Rishi Sunak to tell?
What is the story? Well, we need to be really strong on illegal migration. We've got to get these flights off to Rwanda. We've also got to, I think we should have as a manifesto commitment to come out of the ECHR and let there be a referendum on that. Because then we will not be stopped on our, the civil servants cannot stop us trying to enact what we got elected to do. I would like to see an end to this two-tier policing system. And I think if we really want to see a microcosm of what it would look like with Labour in government, look at how the Mayor of London manages things, look at the streets. Look at Transport for London. They want to put it in public ownership, all trains, etc. It will be like the Transport of London, overspent, etc. So I think we need to take the fight to Labour. We need common sense politics. We need to ensure we don't have a two-tier policing system and stop stifling free speech. It's about freedom for me.
Just very quickly, in a scale of 1 to 100. 100 being you're certain he's going to listen to you, and 0 being he's going to ignore you. What are the chances that Rishi Sunak will take your advice?
Well, I think he's staring down the barrel of a gun, isn't he? As every Conservative is. And I think that if every Conservative, whether it's One Nation, whether it's the Thatcherite Conservatives like myself, we've got to wake up and smell the coffee. We've got to actually start delivering true Conservative values. So I think he's got to listen. Do I think he'll listen? I think he might listen a little bit, not to just me, but to other MPs as well. And I mean, I was his PPS in the early days of a junior minister, and I saw that he could be strong. So I want him to be strong. But come on, bring Boris back on the front line as well, Prime Minister.
OK, I'm assessing that as a 10%. Thank you very much, Dame Andrea.
Thank you.
Next up, Eurovision Week is on us, but in a year overshadowed by protests over the inclusion of Israel, the organisers tell us there's no place for politics in the competition.
I'm gobsmacked that we're actually in this situation. The story started about 4 years ago when locals noticed trees were being cut down. It's a site of special scientific interest. You can't even cut trees down without a licence. But they were told that nothing was wrong and it was all fine. And then, slowly but surely, the rubbish started to arrive, and it just simply hasn't stopped since then, until the wood is covered in hundreds of tonnes of illegal toxic waste. Well, I visited yesterday to meet some of the locals, and within meters of getting out of my car, I was just hit with this toxic smell of sulphur, really catching in the back of your throat. And at this time of year, I should be greeted with the smell of bluebells. But instead, those huge piles of waste that you can see there are giving off these toxic fumes. And it makes it very difficult for for anyone to go even near the woodlands. And that wood is full of things like deer, as well as all the bluebells. And what impact is it having on those creatures? It's not going to be good. This is an environmental disaster on a huge scale. How can this not be breaking any laws? The locals are relatively helpless. They have gathered together. They've started up a petition online. They have spoken to the Environment Agency. They have spoken to the police. They are doing everything they can, but they are a small number of people in a rural community. And we really need the authorities to get behind this. I know they've had a meeting. They've talked about clear-up costs of getting to £10 million. Who's going to be paying for that clear-up? When's it going to start? There's a huge number of questions yet to be answered. I think the general public care hugely what happens to our bluebell woodlands. We are, as a nation, we're home to over 50% of the world's bluebells. We should be protecting them. And yes, £10 million might do the job, but it's then going to take hundreds of years for those trees to regrow back to that ancient woodland that it once was. So I do have hope, but it's going to take an awful lot of time and determination from the authorities to do the right thing.
Now, from one type of politics to another. Europe and Australia will descend on the Swedish city of Malmö this week for the Eurovision Song Contest. But this year, a competition that usually celebrates music, diversity all things glitter, has instead been marred by a bitter row over the participation of Israel, with tens of thousands expected to protest across Sweden. Earlier this week, I spoke to Jean-Philippe de Tonder, the Deputy Director General of the European Broadcasting Union, which organises the contest. Can you explain why Israel has been allowed to compete when Russia and Belarus have not?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we do understand the concerns and the deeply held views that many people have around the war in the Middle East. And I think nobody can remain untouched by the profound suffering of everybody involved in that war. The Eurovision Song Contest is a music event which is organized and co-produced by 37 public broadcasters. So it's not a competition between nations or governments. We do understand that there was some concern around Israel participating, but when our governing bodies, because we're a member-led organization, reviewed the participation list of this year, they concluded that Kan, which is the Israeli public broadcaster, met all of the obligations compared to the competing rules. The situation with Russia is different. With Russia, there was a broad consensus within the membership of the EBU that they could not participate. But on top of that, also the 3 Russian members of the EBU have, in the weeks following the invasion of the war, being excluded from the membership of the EBU because they were in breach of member obligations. And that's not the case for Kan, the public service broadcaster in Israel.
There was outrage in November when Kan published a video of children singing for, and this is the word they used, the annihilation of Gaza. And then one of their presenters was seen writing, I'm quoting here, "I want to send the people of Gaza artillery shells." Is that the kind of conduct that you feel is acceptable from a member of the EBU?
Yeah. We have been in touch, with the authorities, with the senior executives at Kan in preparation of the Eurovision Song Contest, and also in terms of their editorial output. And when there were concerns about some, of the content that they published, we also expressed it to them, and some of that content has been removed.
I suppose many people would say, why bring politics into this at all, with something which should be joyous and inclusive and not bother itself with all that stuff?
Yeah. I do understand, and I fully agree. It is a family event, and the great thing about this music competition is that it's all about values. It's about uniting on stage all of these young talents, these participants, and they do great. It's about diversity and inclusion. But there are competition rules, and you need to follow the competition rules and take decisions based on these competition rules. If we were to exclude Kan outside of these competition rules, that would have been a political decision as such, which we cannot take. And by the way, we're fully in line with all of the other international federations, like sports federations, who also have Israel participating in their events.
Polling by local newspapers have shown that people in Malmö don't actually want the contest there. How are the participants and visitors going to feel safe there? And are you absolutely sure that you can keep this thing secure and safe?
Well, safety of the attendees and staff of the Eurovision Song Contest is of the utmost importance. That's why months ago we started talking to the local authorities, which in this case is the Swedish broadcaster, SVT, the city of Malmö, the police and the law enforcement authorities. Security is not new. We have stepped up security in the last, couple of years because this is a big event which has a huge impact. And this year it is no different than any other years. So we work closely with all of these authorities and we follow what is happening.
Both Israel and Ukraine are at war. Both Israel and Ukraine are amongst the favourites to win this year. If either of them does win, what are you going to do about holding it next year? Because the winner always hosts the next contest.
Mm-hmm. Well, exactly. The focus now is on producing these 3 shows. We don't anticipate on who is going to win. When the winner is announced, that's when we take steps. And when 2 years ago Ukraine won, and when it was impossible, to host it in Ukraine because of obvious circumstances, then we worked out another solution, which was great. It was great to have the UK and the BBC to embrace the Eurovision Song Contest and to host it, on behalf of Ukraine as well. So if that were to be the case again this year for Ukraine or Israel, we'll take the necessary steps then. But by now, every of the 37 candidates is a potential winner, and we wish them all good luck. And also you in the UK.
Jean-Philippe de Tonder from the European Broadcasting Union there. And if you scan the QR code on your screen, you can watch an extended version of that interview if you can't wait to get your full fix of Eurovision. Now, back to our stellar panel, Guto Harry, Miranda Green and Lionel Barber. Miranda, let me show you this. Labour has gained the lead in Scotland. And in fact, what's interesting here is the way that the SNP vote, that yellow line, has just declined since 2021. What do you make of John Swinney's?
Well, it's not John Swinney's first rodeo, is it? He's not only, as he said, been deputy leader in power until about a year ago, he also led the SNP for a few years in the early 2000s before they became the government in Scotland. Their party has got some of the same problems as the Tories in Westminster, which is just the cost of governing for this period of time and people looking at your delivery and saying, what have you actually done for the country? But also the chaos in the SNP in the last sort of 2 to 3 years has been extraordinary. And he obviously is trying to say he's a sober individual. I thought it was a wonderful euphemism. We're not really perhaps as cohesive as we might be, considering the extraordinary stories, that we've had, not least police matters and investigations. But, even though I think Labour will do very well in Scotland against this background of SNP chaos, I still wouldn't sort of sell SNP stock, because then when it comes to the Holyrood elections with a Labour government across the UK, if there's disappointment with Labour, you might get the SNP ticking up again. And that independence fight has not gone away. Support for independence has stayed really high.
Still nearly half.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's off the agenda. That was the absolute clear message you got from John Swinney. It's such, yes, but what's for now? I mean, this isn't going to happen anytime soon because you've had, as you say, criminal inquiries going right to the top in the Sturgeon family, plus an under-delivered, complete shambles in terms of delivery of services in Scotland. This is the untold story. And he's saying, I've got to sort it out. I really need time. There is no way we want to start touching independence. Okay. We can keep the flame, but it's like a gas fire. It's that twee flame. It's been turned right down.
Anybody think that if Labour doesn't get a majority, there's a possibility of a pact? They're all saying no.
Yeah, the SNP have had a long time of being one of the most disciplined and inspiring sort of political fighting forces in the UK. They were on a roll for a long time. It's imploded. And I think in that sense, their impact on the Westminster election is going to be very, very marginal now. And it's a gain for Labour there, pretty much. Doesn't change balance.
We've got a minute and a half. I want to ask you about something which I think it seems important from the last few days, which is the emergence of the Metro mayors as a really serious political force. And I'm wondering here, if Labour does win, and whoever wins, have they stored up a sort of new barony or set of baronies that's just going to give them trouble?
Well, it's going to give a whole load of targets. I was in City Hall. I think it's a good form of government. If you look at the lack of enthusiasm for politicians in general at the moment, contrast that with the enthusiasm for Andy Burnham in Manchester or for Andy Street, who was a victim really of central government, not of his own failings, Ben Houchin as well. People see that the accountability that comes with having one human being responsible for everything is a good way of delivering services. I think in London we had a pretty lousy choice, and Sadiq Khan was lucky to get a third term. He's had as long in power now as Ken Livingstone and Bot. But there's a list of targets now for people to go for once there's been a change at Westminster.
Very quickly.
Trevor, we're into an age of no-label politics. I mean, here I am with my blue tie. Ben Houchin, you couldn't see any blue on him at all up in Teesside.
Red Miranda?
Well, up to a point, because, you know, as we saw with Andy Street, even a record of, you know, being a very good municipal government won't save you on a night where there's an electoral earthquake going on, because you're still part of a ticket. And arguably, Andy Street should have resigned from the Tory party over HS2, stood as an independent, and then who knows, which he nearly did, apparently.
That's all we've got time for this morning. Thanks for being with us. See you next week.